So good morning. My name is John Thornton with Clean Future, and I'm here to happy to talk about not just reducing petroleum, but actually seeing some economic benefit beyond just your fuel use, but actually see some benefit from carbon reduction. So, next slide. So, a little bit about my background. My company works with fleets and fleet end users and others to look at alternative fuel use, and really we do a lot of consulting looking at the economic benefits. Of course, you get a cleaner fleet operation. One of the big tools in our toolbox is actually looking at these carbon credits and opportunities to actually monetize those and provide an incentive back to fleets to use use these cleaner technologies. Next slide. One more minute. So we work a lot with energy efficiency, fleet efficiency. We've done a lot of work with fleets, with the utility industry and others, and certainly we do a lot of work in electric. We do a lot of work in other alternative fuels as well. Next slide. So we look at transportation and carbon emissions. This is a look at in California what the greenhouse gas contribution is, and as you can see, transportation is one of the biggest components of that. So California has put in place some laws and rules and regulations to really help move the market and change that in transportation. And what that is called is the low carbon fuel standard. That's what California calls it. These are also sometimes called clean fuel programs, which is what Oregon calls it. Those are the only two states that have this currently. There are other states that are developing this and will be rolling out in the future. And what this is all about, reducing the life cycle greenhouse gas content of different fuels. So what that means is it's really a regulation on importers or refiners of diesel and gasoline in the state of California, where they are mandated to reduce the life cycle carbon content in their fuels. And really there's two ways these obligated or regulated parties do this. They can either blend in a biofuel, or they can go out and buy a credit from another fuel that produces credits. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both blending, but more so about credits, which is really where the fleets have the biggest opportunity to participate in this. And the other unique thing about this is it is fuel and technology agnostic. So this regulation, the low carbon fuel standard, it actually recognizes and rewards any fuel that's lower in carbon content than regular fossil gasoline and diesel. So, whether it's a liquid fuel, whether it's a gaseous fuel, whether it's electricity, those are all recognized, and it really it's also something to recognize that on a performance basis. So those fuels that do more to reduce the carbon content are rewarded more as far as the credit value, which translates into an economic value. So with reducing petroleum use and reducing conventional fuel use, there are other co-benefits that come with this. Of course, we reduce a lot of criteria pollutants. So the low carbon fuel standard is all about reducing greenhouse gases, but many times when you're reducing those greenhouse gases, you're getting co-benefits and you're reducing the other pollutants. So I mentioned the low carbon fuel standard is a performance standard. So if we look at this chart up here, this is kind of a visualization of what that regulation is doing. And the solid black line is essentially what the obligated parties are mandated to reduce the amount of carbon in their fuel over time. The black line is kind of what's happened historically. And then last year, the California Resources Board essentially adopted strengthened and extended the rules. So where before it went through 2020, now it goes through 2030. And really what they're requiring is by 2030 there's a 20% reduction in the carbon content of fuel relative to the baseline. So if you're importing or refining fuel, you basically want to follow that curve down. You want to be on that line by natural inherent characteristics of diesel and gasoline. You're going to be above that line in carbon intensity, so you're essentially generating a deficit based on whatever carbon content of the fuel. And again, they want to blend in a biofuel or purchase a credit to basically balance to get down to the line. So these other lower carbon fuels that are below the line, they produce credits so that, again, the regulated parties need to essentially buy credits or blend to hit that line, and it gets more stringent every year. So when you think about what's eligible in the low carbon fuel standard, again, it works for a variety of fuel vehicle combinations. So certainly the liquid fuels, ethanol, biodiesel, diesel, those are eligible. Gaseous fuels, natural gas, propane, hydrogen, those are eligible. And again, electricity. Interestingly enough, starting in January, they made some regulation changes where also certain fuel infrastructure can also generate credits on a capacity basis rather than before it was just based on fuel dispense. But for hydrogen fueling stations that meet certain conditions, you can generate credits not just for how much fuel you pump out, but also just having that capacity there available. And then on DC fast charge, same thing, where again, not just the amount of energy put out, but basically having the capacity available. So that was really meant to be kind of to solve that chicken and the egg versus, there's no infrastructure, there's no vehicles, so they're really incenting getting more infrastructure out here to support the vehicles. So I'll just talk briefly about kind of drop-in fuels and kind of the context of this. So, we think about there's kind of two categories of fuels. One would be a drop-in fuel, so like a liquid fuel, where there would be very little change to your engine, your control system, your infrastructure, fueling. So there's kind of that, and for that, much easier to adopt versus the non-drop-in fuels that are going to require a change to technology, behavior. May have to change the engine fuel system or infrastructure. So with this, this is one of those things that the low carbon fuel standard really provides a good benefit for people to help kind of induce them to change on the non-drop-in fuels. Next slide, please. So I kind of take a broad look at all these fuels in the low carbon fuel standard. Again, liquid, gaseous, and electric. Next slide. And again, on the drop-in fuels, inherently there's not much change to the fleet. In that case, it does generate credits. It comes through, should hopefully come through to you guys in price. But again, most of what I'm going to be talking about are, again, the next slide, would be the non-drop-in fuels that require more, more changes, whether it's natural gas that requires a fueling infrastructure, engine change, and all that. And next slide. So in my business, we spend a lot of time working with fleets to kind of help them look at these alternative fuels and really, help address the barriers or the perceived barriers. I mean, with going to changing fuels, you're looking at, how does this impact my ability to do my job? I've got to deliver goods, I've got to deliver services, I've got to move people, That's all well and good. That's my main concern. But if I look at these alternative fuels, what does that mean for me as far as what I need to change? So there are perceived barriers about higher vehicle cost, perceived barriers about fueling infrastructure, also change. So again, these market mechanisms provide us a good chance to really help provide a benefit to help offset or encourage people to address those. And really, excuse me, one of the biggest ways we do this is looking at the total cost of ownership. So when we're looking at these alternative fuels and technologies, there's oftentimes a higher acquisition cost, but there can be a lower operating cost over the long term. So really we'll look at that on a whole life cycle basis and do the calculations, help fleets understand what those trade-offs are, help them understand that it's not just about that first cost, but it's all about that total life cycle cost. And then to go with that, kind of buy down that that acquisition cost. There are also grants and incentives available. Certainly the Sacramento Air District, they provide grants. The state provides grants. There are federal and other sources available. Back up, backwards. So really those are something to help buy down that acquisition cost. And then the topic today, we're talking about monetizing carbon or the low carbon fuel standard. That provides something to actually further buy down that operating cost on an ongoing basis. Next slide. So just to kind of, again, compare and contrast grants versus market-based incentives. So we have grants and vouchers. Those are, again, applied towards just that first cost of the vehicle. That does nothing for your ongoing side. These carbon credits or low carbon fuel standard, that's basically an ongoing or repeating, recurring revenue stream. And again, that's proportional to the amount of eligible fuel you use. A lot of the grants are available both at the local, state, regional level. Again, the low carbon fuel standard is a California only regulation, and then again there's a similar regulation in Oregon, similar program basically based on California's rules, but those are the only two states that have that currently. And again, grants are one time, the low carbon fuel standard is ongoing, and again, acquisition based versus a one time versus ongoing. And I guess the big thing to think about is these actually complement or stack on top of one another. So I've not come across any grants that basically preclude the low carbon fuel standards. So you can essentially get a grant to be able to get that first vehicle, and then you can essentially monetize that carbon credit to see the ongoing benefits. So they work together. There are some restrictions around low carbon fuel standard where you can't match things with the renewable portfolio standard or other things, but as far as traditional grants, they all work together, so they're very beneficial. So again, when we think about that total cost of ownership, a lot of times fleets and buyers are concerned about paying more for that electric, paying more for that CNG vehicle where I've got to basically modify the vehicle, add tanks, modify my engine or fuel system. So those are naturally something to be concerned about, but again, a lot of times we don't think about that long term, that total cost of ownership. There's the fuel cost, there's the maintenance cost, there's the ongoing cost. That's really the piece that's kind of below the surface that people don't always have a good handle on. So again, grants work in the top part on the acquisition. These low carbon fuel standards, these carbon credits work on that ongoing piece to further improve that for the fleet. So switching gears a little bit, we talked about the carbon side. On the grants, there's a lot of other things you look at, and Keith asked me to talk a little bit about some metrics. So just at a very high level, a lot of these grants are looking at outcome based as far as what sort of emission reduction you get, whether it's a pollutant or what sort of emission reduction you get on greenhouse gases. And of course, there's always the economic benefits as well. And there's a number of resources available to fleets, to look at that. So I just listed a few there to think about. There's one called A-Fleet, which is basically a tool from one of the national labs that will help people look at kind of that total fleet life cycle cost. And there's a lot of data in there that you can kind of use typical vehicle costs. It will have attributes as far as emission reduction costs and all that. I would refer you to your Clean Cities folks because they're familiar with that, or a lot of consultants are familiar with that. There's some other tools. There's what's known as a DEQ or diesel emission quantifier, and this is something that is required when you to do the calculations when you're applying for any federal funding through the National Clean Diesel or even local Clean Diesel, or sometimes also known as DERA, Diesel Emission Reduction Act funds. So that's a mandatory tool. And again, there's a variety of tools available to the Clean Cities coordinators that I would encourage you to talk to them. They can look at fleet, infrastructure planning, a number of things there. Your air districts would be another resource. A lot of times they will have their own internal tools they'll use that they can help you guys run through the numbers and look at things. And then increasingly the vehicle or equipment OEMs are getting more sophisticated. So a lot of times they will have some version of a calculator or tool where they can look at what that, what that life cycle cost and what that ROI would be. So those tools are available. And then again, a lot of times consultants or other people will have tools. My company has some very specialized tools for instance, we do a lot of work with refrigerated fleets. We've developed a very robust tool set for that. Some other very niche applications where we build out some very, very comprehensive tools. And then the other one, which is more related to the low carbon fuel standard, but they will look at that kind of total life cycle cost or life cycle carbon content that is done for different fuel or vehicle combinations. Next slide. So I guess so does anybody have any questions? Ethan?
Will you be getting into the actual value of the DC fast chargers, capacity, and
yes? So I've got that's kind of the second half. I've got a number of examples of some different vehicles and fuel combinations. I don't think I ran one specifically about exactly for DC fast charge. I've got a level 2 up there, but we can certainly look at that. I can get into that a little more.
great? Thank you.
So I had a question. You mentioned propane, and in California right now, we don't have any renewable propane sources, but I think there may be some in Oregon. And I heard some rumors about the fact that there were some people who were beginning to at least make renewable gasoline, and I don't know if you know anything about that or whether it's currently available anywhere or if anybody has any plans to actually market renewable gasoline.
Yeah, so in renewable propane, so there is renewable propane that's coming to market. I'm not really aware of anything that's in the market yet for California or Oregon. It's getting close. Actually, renewable propane is actually a byproduct oftentimes for renewable diesel production. So it's a byproduct that a couple of the providers are going through the efforts and the tribulations with CARB, California Resources Board, where they essentially have to go through a very comprehensive process to establish what that carbon intensity is and essentially get that certified. So that's probably one of the reasons renewable propane is not quite there yet. I know CARB recently released some, I guess, guidance or kind of what they'll say default values for that. So I think it's coming. It'll be here soon. And actually, propane is actually something that's newer in the low carbon fuel standard, effective this year. They just put a new regulation, a new amended regulation in place in January, and before propane was not eligible. It is now eligible in several cases in low carbon fuel standard. And on your question on renewable gasoline, I'm not aware of anything that's on the market yet. I think there are some things that are in development, but I don't know too much about that yet.
I did have one other question.
Yep.
Are you going to get to the success that you had with one of your clients relative to getting funding back because of work that you've done in the second part of your presentation?
Yeah, so I'll have a number of examples of kind of little case studies of basically value that the fleets are either getting back or about ready to get back on, again, monetizing the carbon side. And I guess actually I didn't do this, but we could have I should have put in there, we've got a couple fleets where we've got actually helped them get grant money. And then on that grant money, then we're helping them get the carbon money too. So yes, I'll get into quite a bit of detail coming up.
Good, thank you.
So I'll go ahead and maybe pass the baton to Rafe, and you can talk a little bit and take it from there.